Two interesting readings this morning. Both not always in the lectionary does the first reading relate to the second reading, but certainly there are a lot of commonalities. We've got mountains. We've got one person who is in commonality. That's the person of Moses. Moses is in the Old Testament reading and in the New Testament reading at the top of the mountain. We've got bright shining lights. Moses has the shining face. Then we see the bright lights there. There is an allusion to much and some similarities. Did you see that when the readings came out? Yeah? And I have to say, I want to focus on the reading today from Luke's Gospel, which is about what we call the Transfiguration. Now, you all know what Transfiguration is, don't you? No. Glad, because I didn't. It's one of those words we use. It's a very Christian word that we use. In fact, the only other time that I can say it and know of it, and this I was only reminded of this when I was doing some study on this earlier this week, was in the Harry Potter movies, when they do spells of transfiguration. That's the only time I've come across this word in another context. Maybe you know of it, but it's about this time when Jesus takes three disciples to the top of the mountain, Peter, James and John, and they go up and they pray, and they have some kind of mystical encounter. Ask me to explain the mystical encounter, I can't. But sometimes there are simply mysteries in the scriptures, aren't there? And at the top of this mountain, it's easy for me to say this morning, at the top of this mountain is confronted by Elijah and Moses, the great lawgiver and the great prophet. And they're talking about something. It says here that they're talking about Jesus' departure. Well, if you actually want to be very technical and get back into the original language, which was being written in at this stage, the word is Jesus' exodus. So back there when we have the first reading, Moses is in the beginning of the Exodus. Now, do we know what the Exodus story is? It's not a film that was put out in about 1958. It's actually a story about the people of Israel who were taken out of the land of slavery into a land of freedom and wandered round in the desert for 40 years to try to understand what it meant to be the people of God, to be the light amongst the nations. And there are many arguments to whether they did or didn't, but certainly that is the story of the Exodus. You must know the story of the Exodus, true? Here we are speaking about a second Exodus, the Exodus of Jesus. And that is the Exodus where we participate in new beginnings. We break free of the old and take on that which is new. And that's what is being discussed as Jesus, Moses and Elijah sit there. And the disciples are thrilled about it. In fact, I take a lot of heart from the disciples, because being great disciples, and whenever we hear the word disciples, we can often relate the word church to that, because they are prototypes of the church, being truly who they always are. What were they doing? They were sleeping. Now, I don't know about you, but with all this going on, with all this brightness and brilliance and Moses and Elijah there, why on earth should they be sleeping? It seems ludicrous, doesn't it? But this is a literary device for us to start to respond. And the response of the disciples in all ways is very much the response that we have now. Now, I take some heart that even Jesus, Moses and Elijah can preach, and their community fall asleep on them. Their congregation fall asleep. So if you fall asleep today during my service, that's okay, because it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. But they fall asleep. But that's often the way, isn't it, for us at the church? Even when there is magnificence around us, we can be found sleeping at the wheel. Some respects, it's almost harking to something that's going to happen up another mount at the end of 40 days for Jesus. Because, as you know, we're about to enter the period of Lent, aren't we? This week Lent starts. Well, that means Easter's here, but it's an early Easter. But usually Easter marks for me sort of how well the year's going. It gives me a sense of, when it's not the beginning of the year anymore, we're well and truly into it. And there is this 40-day lead up, which we call Lent. And sometimes we give up things. I've given up some significant things over Lent in past times, and who knows what I will give up this year. But it's a time of preparation and thought. But it's a time which relates to the 40 years in the wilderness. A time of struggle, a time of suffering, but a time of trying to understand what is God's will in all of this. So it starts gloriously with all this happening, but the disciples are sleeping. And that causes me to ask the question even today. What are Jesus' disciples doing when so much is going on around us in the world? In our prayers of the people, in our prayers of confession, I talked about the din around us. You know, it's so easy to just fall asleep to the fact of what we actually do have in terms of our faith, in terms of life, and in terms of future. So they're about to undergo a bad time, but they're fallen asleep, and it takes us right back to that mount just before Jesus is crucified. What are the disciples doing when Jesus is at Gethsemane? They've fallen asleep. Despite of the 40 days preparation, have they learnt anything in the meantime? It's a question mark there, isn't it? What do we actually learn from all this stuff? Week in, week out, we come, we hear the good news. We hear stories that are supposed to lift our lives. Not just our lives, but the lives of the people around us. And yet, so often, the church can be sleeping. So then, once they're awake and Peter pops his head up, Peter does the second thing the church does. When you see something good happening, you build a monument to it, and you stay on the little monument. The church is full of religious buildings, religious artifacts that are supposed to be little shrines to something that has happened somewhere along the way. In many respects, we are good at building shrines, yet not moving on. The journey will start from today, from this fantastic beginning. They will wander until they get to Jerusalem. This is the doorway of the journey to Jerusalem. An amazing journey that has its miracles, but ultimately ends on a cross before we can get to resurrection life. There is much turmoil, there is much suffering, and there is much difficulty. I've been rattling on about change for a few weeks, haven't I? I'm a minister, I'm allowed to prattle on, that's what we do. We even get paid for it. But my friends, if we expect that we are going to undertake a truly religious journey, a true spiritual journey that brings some fulfillment out in the end, we will have some pain and some suffering along the way, because that is the way of life. Very few of us can skate through life unscathed without its difficulties. And if you can, praise God, because lucky you, because the majority of us have to face some pretty tough stuff along the way. True? Yeah? The journey of faith, the journey towards resurrection life, and dare I say, even our journey, as we look at where our church will go, will not be an easy one. Will be one with struggles and difficulties. At times we will want to fall asleep at the wheel, because it's much easier to fall asleep when the painful things happen, because at least while you're sleeping, the painful things just go on around you, but you're still sleeping, aren't you? It's almost comatose. And I would argue the church loves to be sitting in a comatose place with its nice religious songs, with its nice religious words, rather coming into true interaction. I used to say, you've got to come off the mountain and go down and confront the realities of the world. But up amongst this incredible meeting of Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. They are discussing real life, tough issues. The issue of faith, the issue of life, the issue of death, and ultimately the issue of resurrection. This is not just some nice picnic they are participating in. They're all getting their jollies and all feeling happy about. This is the beginning of a tough journey, one where it says, Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem and all that that means. Yeah, sure, there's a triumphal entry, but within 3 days that goes pretty wrong, doesn't it? And then 3 days later, the hope, the belief, and the assurance of resurrection is given for all believers. My friends, these stories are easy to skate over. We hear it every year, the story of Transfiguration. It leads us in, and each of the disciples who writes the Gospels has a different take on it. But what is our take on this story? Because stories are written there, but these stories are meant to impact our life as people of faith and as a church in this place. What does it mean to us as we read about Jesus on the mountain? And yes, we can relate to the disciples who fall asleep, even when the exciting stuff and big stuff's going, when the whiz-bangs are going off. The church has been pretty comatose. We can build our shrine and say, wasn't it good that day? Do you remember back in 1957 when we had that fantastic service with 300 young people and the singing Christmas tree? And they were all there at church doing their thing. And the ministers then were so good, weren't they? They were much better than the ones we have now. The one we had hair. Goodness me. And I loved it. One of my churches in Ballarat I went to, and they had this man called Frank, who'd been their minister 20 years before. And dear Frank must have been the most saintly man who has ever walked this earth. He would ride 60 kilometres a day to visit at least 8 parishioners. He would preach 3 sermons in a week. He would lead 5 Bible studies. He kept the women's group going. And dear old Frank, do you think any minister could measure up to how good Frank was? I actually did meet Frank many years later. And I sort of revered, I bowed and moved away from him. And I said, Frank, you must have done an extraordinary job. And he said, I worked hard, but no harder than any other minister. I visited a few people, but no more than any other minister. He said, in fact, I was a very ordinary minister, and I wish I had my time again to have another go. And I said, but the people thought you were so fantastic. He says, yes, but with memories things change. It's true, isn't it? We can look back and herald past days of when the church had an impact, when its voice was heard throughout the nation. Unfortunately, the voice that we are hearing from the church, if you'd have been looking at the television recently with Archbishop Pell, is certainly not one that we want to be hearing. And what they are saying is not very good. We have lost our credibility in so many ways. We are shrinking and diminishing in our numbers in Australia, as I've said before. And I say that not to make us feel guilty, but to realise the influence and power that we were is no longer. And yet maybe that's a good thing. Maybe amongst all of this, we can sit, we can re-examine, and we can rethink these old stories that are there to encourage us, to lead us, to guide us, and sustain us, even through dark and difficult days. My friends, Lent is about to come upon us, and we will have our Pancake Tuesday, hopefully. Some of you will be cooking pancakes for local communities to make money for share. But what it actually is the journey into a time far more reflective, far more thoughtful about where is the journey of faith going? What is happening at this point? Where is Jesus in our world here today? I am more and more convinced that if Jesus was to be here, we would be exactly the same as the old disciples. We would fall for the same tricks. Why? Because that's what we do. We are good at falling asleep, and we are excellent at making shrines. My friends, we worship a living God. Paul says these words, which I sort of live with, and because of the language, I don't sit well. And he says, present yourselves as holy and living sacrifices. Have you heard that? One of my very close friends, who is a great liturgist, used to say when we were at Bible college together, the only problem with living sacrifices is they keep on getting off the altar. And maybe that's pretty true. We say, yes, we hear God. We sing the songs that say, choose me, God, lead me, God, guide me, God. And yet, how many of us really want to be led? How many of us really want to be chosen? Because that has dire circumstances. So today, as we sit on top of a metaphorical mountain, enjoying all that we have, that which has been given to us from past generations, we now say, what do we now do with this? There is a question. And perhaps the journey of Lent is the question. What does this all mean for me? As we as a congregation seek our future, seek to understand what God is saying to us, I pray that we have the courage to leave the question and ask the question of ourselves. What does God require of us here now? And so as we do this, as we prepare ourselves for this journey ahead, let us ask God for God's blessing upon each and every one of us. Amen.